Hello, I'm PhocusWire Editor-in-Chief Mitra Sorrells, and I am joined today by Nina Wittkamp. She is partner, and Evgeni Kochman, associate partner from McKinsey. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Mitra. Good to have you.
Thanks for having us. Looking forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Great to have you here. So today we are talking about innovation in travel, whether this is sort of the start of a new era for the industry. Let's start by discussing startup funding. Can you give us a sense of where startup funding stands in total and how it has differed in travel compared to other industries?
Yeah, happy to start with that one. Thanks a lot for the question, Mitra. It's an extremely interesting one. So you see, despite the recent and very difficult years in travel, we've actually seen continuous growth in the travel startup funding, which has resulted in an overall CAGR between 2010 and 2022 of 30% in funding. So this is a substantial growth in terms of money flowing into this industry if you consider that the overall industry growth in terms of revenue in the same period was only 2%. So it's 15-fold higher. The interesting piece is, though, that still, if you compare travel to other industries like life science, financial services, media, or retail, retail actually only takes 2% of all the fundings which are happening in the world. And with that, it is a bottom three industry in terms of startup funding. So if you want to take another lens on it, funding in travel is only less than 1% of the overall industry revenue. So it's really little. And this is why we believe that travel remains a structurally underfunded industry, especially for an industry that is actually contributing up to 10% of overall global GDP.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of potential for opportunities there, I guess. So let's talk about any differences that you are seeing in actually attracting funding in travel and to travel companies and startups compared to other industries.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And after coming out a few years of a global pandemic, I think we've seen that the specific challenge for the travel sector is that it's incredibly volatile and typically follows overall economic performance. And of course, funding also reflects that. But to add to the challenge, the travel sector is very global and international in nature, and typically relies on a whole ecosystem and value chain of sales and distribution partners, etc., that need to work together. And so it's very difficult to find point solutions that can be disrupted and then just scale, in isolation of the rest of the ecosystem. And of course, that has made it a lot more difficult for startups in rolling out and scaling their solutions, but also in attracting funding that otherwise goes to other sectors. But nevertheless, there are a number of companies that have disrupted their specific areas that are category leaders. If we think about shared mobility, for example. And we're typically seeing that investors like to follow the winners. And, given that scale plays an important factor in this industry, the winners or the fast-moving companies typically take it all. And so that's what we've also seen reflected in funding. A lot of the disruptions have been happening on the, some of the physical transportation side, but mostly actually on digital aspects like user interface, booking platforms that have carried a lot of legacy in the past.
And how would you say that investor appetite has changed in some of the most recent years?
Well, interestingly enough, despite the pandemic, funding and investor sentiment has actually increased. I think investors are seeing the potential of disruption and innovation potential that startups can bring to an industry like the travel sector. But overall, we've seen some peak funding in the years of 2021 and 2022, right in the middle of the pandemic, and also other difficult macroeconomic environments with inflation and geopolitical challenges. And still, the amount of funding and investment has increased by 5x, which I find really remarkable, and I think is a sign of potential that the investor community is seeing in the travel sector.
Yeah, I would have to say it is certainly something that we hear so much about. It seems like every day we are getting news of funding and advancements and acquisitions and different things happening in the space. So that certainly aligns with that. And then what would you say, what have been some recent structural trends in startup funding in travel in particular?
So in our research, we've come across 5 main themes that are shaping the trends in startup funding in the industry. Number 1 is the geographical consolidation. So what we've seen is that almost 60% of the startup funding is flowing into startups in North America, especially in the last couple of years. And this is quite eye-opening if you think about that North American travel market is only responsible for 29% of the overall industry revenue. So this is where we see that investors are really believing in North American startups in the travel industry being at the front line of innovation. The second piece is more that we have seen funding focusing on early stage and on the other side of the spectrum, exit funding. So this means that we have seen less investments into early and late growth. We believe that this is especially driven by the financing situation, which we have seen in recent years and especially last year, where you've seen more scrutiny on startups focusing on profitability and a changing situation in the interest rates. Potentially, this is something that we will see reverse a little bit through the next years, but this is what was especially true in the last ones. Now, the third trend is focused more on investments into new verticals, especially in-trip categories, so holiday experiences and business travel, have both doubled their share of overall funding, which is really good to see because we now see new categories actually on the rise and shaping the innovation in the industry. The fourth trend is a consolidation and funding into selected startups. So basically funding larger category leaders. And this has been specifically true in categories outside of hospitality. So in growing verticals, in holiday experience, but also business travel. On the other side, I think hospitality was the only exception where we have seen a stronger diversification. Generally, we have really seen a focus on sub-vertical category leaders. And the last piece is really how funding was done. And here we see a specific focus on debt and public sector financing in 2021. I think this was a year strongly driven also by IPOs and debt financing with banks due to the interest rate situation. I think this will be reversing as well, especially in the new macroeconomic situation and the change in interest rates. So it will be interesting to observe down the road.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we are out of time. Nina and Evgeni, thank you so much for talking to us about innovation in travel.
Thank you, Mitra. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Mitra.
Bye-bye.